It was a Tuesday in late October, and the maples along our street in Sudbury had already shed most of their leaves. I remember that detail clearly because I had just finished raking the backyard when my phone rang. I set the rake against the fence, pulled off my gardening gloves, and answered without looking at the screen. It was my daughter Maya's neighbor, Linda. Her voice was careful in that way people get when they're trying not to alarm you before they have to. "Dorothy," she said, "I think you need to come to Maya's house. Something's happened." I drove the 11 minutes to Maya's place on Lorne Street without once turning on the radio. When I pulled up, Linda was standing on the front step with her arms crossed tight over her chest. And through the window, I could see Maya sitting at the kitchen table, completely still, like something inside her had simply stopped. I went inside without knocking. Maya was still in her scrubs from her night shift at Health Sciences North. She was 34 years old, a registered nurse who had worked the cardiac unit for 7 years. And she was sitting at her own kitchen table like a woman who had forgotten how to stand up. Her eyes were dry but distant, the kind of dry that comes after a long time of crying when there's nothing left. She looked up when I came in and said, very quietly, "Mom." She went to the hospital. I sat down across from her. "Who did? What happened, Carolyn?" She said her mother-in-law's name, the way you'd say the name of something you'd stepped on in the dark. She went to the hospital and talked to the director of patient care. She told them I'd been stealing medication from the dispensary. I felt the room go very still. She said she had evidence. "Mom?" She brought printed screenshots of text messages. I don't even know how she got them or whether they're real. But she brought them and she sat down with administration and she told them that she had been worried about me for months. Maya pressed her hands flat on the table. "They've put me on suspension, pending investigation. I had to hand over my badge this morning. I had met Carolyn Whitfield exactly 14 times since my daughter married her son Ethan 4 years ago. I had counted. Not because I was keeping score, but because each of those 14 times had left a mark that took a while to fade. Carolyn was the kind of woman who delivered her cruelty wrapped in concern, who smiled while she did it, who would touch your arm and tilt her head and say something that took you 3 hours of driving home to fully understand had been an insult. She had never once called Maya by her first name. She called her Ethan's wife. At the wedding, she had told her own guests, loudly enough for several people to hear, that she was grateful Ethan had such a generous heart. When Maya had been promoted to charge nurse the previous winter, Carolyn had said it was wonderful that the hospital was so committed to their diversity initiatives. And now she had gone to the hospital and tried to end my daughter's career. "Where's Ethan?" I asked. Maya was quiet for a moment. "He's at work. I called him. He said he was sure there was a misunderstanding and that he'd talked to his mother." I looked at my daughter. She looked back at me with an expression that said everything she hadn't said aloud, that she had been waiting 4 years for her husband to see what was directly in front of him, and that some part of her had stopped waiting. I stayed with Maya for 4 hours that afternoon. I made tea she didn't drink and soup she ate half of. I listened. I let her talk about the suspension, about the investigation process, about what it would mean if it went the wrong way, that she could lose her nursing license, that 7 years of her career would be undone, that the profession she had worked for since she was 22 years old could be taken from her based on fabricated evidence delivered by a woman who had resented her from the moment she walked through the door. Before I left, Maya said, almost to herself, she told Linda, before all this, that a woman like me doesn't really belong in a role like that. She said patients deserve to feel comfortable. She paused. Linda told me last week. She felt terrible for not saying something sooner. I drove home slowly. I called my younger sister Claire from the driveway. Claire was 58. Retired from 25 years as a paralegal at a firm in Toronto. and she was the sharpest person I had ever known in my life. I told her everything. She listened without interrupting, which with Claire meant she was already thinking. When I finished, she said, "Send me everything Maya has. Every text. Every email. Every performance review. Every document from the hospital. Everything." "What are you looking for?" "I'm looking for the truth," she said. "And I'm going to find it before Carolyn's version becomes the only one anyone remembers." Over the next several days, I became a different kind of mother than I had ever needed to be before. I am 63 years old, and I have spent most of my adult life in the quiet work of building things, a home, a family, a garden that takes longer every year, but gives more than it takes. I am not a woman who looks for confrontation, but there are moments in a life where the choice to stay quiet is its own kind of action. And I had made that choice too many times in 4 years of watching Carolyn move through my daughter's life, like weather that no one would acknowledge. Those days were not quiet days. Claire drove up from Toronto on the Thursday. She sat at Maya's kitchen table with her laptop and 3 notepads, and she went through every document Maya had kept. Every email chain. Every shift schedule. Every commendation from her unit manager. Maya, it turned out, had kept records of everything without quite knowing why. The careful instinct of a woman who had spent years feeling like she might someday need to prove herself. "These performance reviews," Claire said on the second evening, pushing her glasses up, "are exceptional. 3 years running." Her manager wrote a specific commendation after the Henderson case in February. She looked at Maya. "Did you keep anything from Carolyn directly? Any messages, any voicemails?" Maya got up and came back with her phone. There were voicemails she had never deleted. She hadn't been able to explain, even to herself, why she'd kept them. Claire listened to all of them, with her notepad open and her face very still. One of the voicemails, left 8 months earlier, had Carolyn's voice saying clearly that Maya's kind of background made her unsuitable for the trust that patients placed in their nurses. It had been left at 2 a.m. after a family dinner where Carolyn had had 2 glasses of wine, and Maya had been called in for an emergency shift and left early. Claire replayed it twice. Then she wrote something down and underlined it. Meanwhile, I had made my own phone calls. I had been on the board of the Sudbury Community Health Auxiliary for 11 years. And in that time I had learned that institutions move slowly, but they do move, and that the people who know how they move are worth knowing. I called a woman named Patricia Okafor, who had been the patient advocacy coordinator at a regional health authority for 20 years before she retired. Patricia and I had sat on 3 committees together. She was methodical and honest, and she understood exactly how a suspension investigation was meant to work and how it could be made to go wrong. Patricia agreed to review the investigation process documentation that the hospital had sent Maya. She called me back the following morning. "Dorothy," she said, "the timeline on this complaint is unusual. The complaint was logged internally on October 14th. Maya's suspension was issued on October 16th. That's 48 hours. That is extremely fast for a process that is supposed to include a preliminary review before any action is taken." She paused. "I'd want to know if anyone on the administrative side has a personal connection to the woman who filed the complaint." I wrote that down. It took Claire 2 more days to find it. She found it not in Maya's documents, but in a public board directory for a charitable foundation. Carolyn Whitfield sat on the fundraising committee of a foundation that had donated to Health Sciences North 3 years in a row. The director of patient care, who had accepted the complaint and signed the suspension order, had been photographed at the foundation's annual gala. There were 3 photographs. In one of them, Carolyn and the director were standing together smiling. And Carolyn had her hand on the director's arm. Claire showed me the photograph on her laptop screen at 9 p.m. "This isn't proof of anything illegal on its own," she said carefully. But it is a documented conflict of interest that should have required the director to recuse herself from any involvement in a complaint filed by someone in her social circle. She didn't recuse herself. She processed the suspension personally. I looked at the photograph for a long time. "What do we do with this?" I asked. "We document everything," Claire said. "Carefully. Completely. And then we put it in front of the right people." I want to be honest about what those weeks felt like. Because I think the feeling is something that doesn't get spoken about enough. There is a particular exhaustion that comes from watching someone you love be harmed by something slow and deliberate and dressed up in respectability. Carolyn had not raised her voice once. She had not made a scene. She had sat in a comfortable office and described her concern for patient safety and the integrity of the healthcare system, and she had done it in a way that sounded so reasonable that the people listening to her had not questioned it. That is a specific kind of harm, the kind that leaves no visible marks, the kind that makes the person it's done to wonder if they imagined it. Maya had not imagined it. She had documented it, without knowing that's what she was doing. For 4 years, Ethan came to the house on a Saturday, the 3rd week of October. He sat across from Maya at that same kitchen table where so much had happened by then. And he looked like a man who had finally turned over a stone and found something he hadn't wanted to see underneath it. He had found the voicemails on his mother's phone. Not the one Maya had kept, different ones. A series of calls Carolyn had made to a woman in her social circle, going back 2 years, in which she described her plan to build a paper trail. She had been patient. She had been deliberate. She had told her friend that she simply could not allow her son's life to be shaped by someone who didn't belong in it. And that she had learned that if you moved carefully and let institutions do the work for you, you didn't have to do anything that looked like cruelty. Ethan had heard those recordings and driven directly to Maya's house. He sat at the table for a long time, not saying much. Then he said, "I didn't see it because I didn't want to see it. That's not an excuse. I'm telling you because I think you deserve the truth of what happened. Even the part of it that involves me." Maya looked at him for a while. She said, "I know." What happened next moved through formal channels, and it moved slowly. The way things that actually stick tend to do. Claire compiled a documentation package, the voicemails, the performance reviews, the photographs, Patricia's written analysis of the procedural irregularities, to the conflict of interest documentation, and she submitted it to the hospital's independent patient advocacy office. With a copy to the College of Nurses of Ontario's inquiry line and a copy to a journalist at a Northern Ontario public health accountability publication who had covered hospital governance issues before, the director of patient care recused herself from the investigation. 11 days later, the new investigator reviewed the complaint and the evidence and found no basis for the allegations against Maya. The suspension was lifted. Maya returned to her unit on a Monday morning in late November, and her manager, a woman named Sandra, who had worked with Maya for 5 years and had submitted a written statement of support during the investigation, met her at the nursing station and said simply, "Welcome back. We've missed you." Carolyn was not charged with anything. I want to be truthful about that. The law does not move as cleanly as we would like it to. And the harm she had attempted was serious, but hard to prosecute directly. What happened to Carolyn was quieter than that. The Foundation's board, upon reviewing the documentation that had become part of the hospital's internal record, asked her to step down from the fundraising committee. The director of patient care resigned 6 weeks later, citing personal reasons, and Ethan, who had grown up in Sudbury and built his professional reputation there, had to decide what to do with the knowledge of what his mother had done. He and Maya are still figuring that out. I won't pretend I know how it ends. Marriage is not simple, and what Carolyn did created a fault line that doesn't disappear just because the crisis is over. but Maya is back at work. She is caring for her patients. She came to my house the first Sunday after her return, and we sat in the kitchen, and I made the apple jam I hadn't gotten around to making in October, and she sat on the counter like she used to when she was 12 years old. And we talked about everything and nothing. And at some point, she leaned her head against the cabinet and closed her eyes, and I could see some weight going out of her shoulders. Before she left, she said, "Mom, how did you know what to do?" I thought about it. I thought about Claire driving up from Toronto with her notepads. I thought about Patricia and her 20 years of understanding how systems work and how they can be made to work better. I thought about all the women in my life who had given me pieces of something I hadn't known I was collecting until I needed it. I didn't know. I told her honestly. I just knew that quiet wasn't the right answer this time. And I knew I wasn't doing it alone. She hugged me for a long time before she walked out to her car. The maples are bare now, and the snow has started. I raked the last of the leaves last weekend. The garden is put to bed for the winter, in the way it has to be every year, not dead. Just waiting. I've learned over 63 years that the things that last are like that. They go underground for a while. They come back. My daughter is a nurse. She is good at it. She is exactly where she belongs. That was never Carolyn's decision to make.